Hello, welcome to Big Picture Monday. My name's Cali Black here with the story version of what's going on in this week's Come Follow Me readings so that you don't have to worry about what is actually happening, and instead you can focus on finding the scriptural applications and listening to the Spirit and what the Spirit whispers to you. Just as a reminder, I'm pre-recording this video. I am still out on my maternity leave, but I want to make sure you still get all the big pictures that you need. This week we are doing the book of Deuteronomy. Yep, the entire book. You know how that goes. And as we study the entire book of Deuteronomy, we're only reading a few chapters, and this assignment might seem so random. In fact, I usually am easily able to memorize it and tell you what the chapters are, but I've got to use my notes for this one. We're reading Deuteronomy chapters 6 through 8, 15, 18, 29 through 30, and 34. There you go. Now, in this video, I'm actually going to explain to you why we read the chapters that we read and what we're skipping. I think it's going to make a little bit more sense. Deuteronomy is not a story book, meaning, hopefully you understand what I mean. It's not a book filled with stories like the book of Numbers that we did last week, where we're learning about how the Israelites made it right to outside of the promised land a year after their captivity had ended in Egypt. But then Moses sent the 12 spies. People of Israel really revealed how their hearts were still lacking a whole lot of faith in the Lord. And so he said, as a consequence, you will now wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And then we see them, they've now come back to the promised land. The 40 years have passed. There've been some issues along the way, but we honestly don't get that much record of what happens in like the 39 years after that first year that they're wandering. But anyways, they get back there. They're conquering some kingdoms. We know that Miriam has died. We know that Aaron has died and passed on the office of the high priesthood to his son. We know that Moses knows that he's not going to enter the promised land. And we do know that Joshua and Caleb, those were the two spies who gave the good reports of the land of Canaan and said, like, yes, we can conquer these people. We have faith. They were promised that they were going to enter. And so that's kind of where we're at. The Israelites have now gone right up to they're in the land of Moab. They're right across the river Jordan from the promised land, and they are there and they're ready to see what else they need to do. That's what we learned in the book of Numbers last week. And so in the book of Deuteronomy, the word Deuteronomy means repetition of the law. Repetition of the law. And so what we find in the book of Deuteronomy, it's actually Moses's 3 final speeches to the Israelites. Pretty cool. We get to just learn from Moses. So he is just preaching important things to the children of Israel, most of which we assume takes place on Mount Nebo. That's the mountain that they're on in the land of Moab as they're getting ready to cross into the promised land. So that's what we're going to study. Let me tell you real quick, the first speech is chapters 1 through 4. We do not study that one at all. It's basically Moses just giving like a recap of what they've been doing for the past 40 years, all the blessings and all the miracles and everything like that they've experienced. So we do not study anything from the first speech, and it's kind of short anyways. The second speech is the super long speech, and this one goes from chapters 5 to chapter 28. So very long speech. We are going to study just like a few random chapters. That's why it kind of makes more sense that we're studying just like random chapters in Deuteronomy, because it's a speech filled with great doctrine and great teachings. And so we can just kind of pop in and read the chapters that seem most applicable to us, the ones that maybe might be able to teach us the most in our modern situation right now. Okay, so let's talk about these chapters. Well, the speech overall, this second speech overall is Moses basically reteaching all of the important things that the children of Israel need to know. Like, here are the commandments, here are the covenants, here are the blessings that you've received, here are some of the festivals that we've been asked to observe. He's kind of recapping, like, here's all of this spiritual knowledge you've amassed over the past 40 years. Let me remind you of this again because it's so important, and also here's why. So we start with our studying in chapter 6, which Moses teaches the Israelites to love the Lord their God. love the Lord their God. And they also need to teach that to their children. They can't just love the Lord their God. They have to teach their children how to love the Lord their God. And then he also talks really about the importance of keeping the commandments. Why do we keep the commandments? What are some of the blessings that come from it? And what happens when we don't keep the commandments as well? Chapter 7, he continues on and tells the Israelites, listen, you are going to go and destroy Canaan. You're going to go conquer the people that are living there, and you're going to take over the land. But once you do, don't marry Canaanites. He says that specifically. The Lord has asked them not to marry Canaanites. The Lord wants to keep the house of Israel as a separate group of people. So he tells them very explicitly, do not marry Canaanites, stay within the house of Israel, because I have special blessings just for people in the house of Israel. In chapter 8, he reminds the Israelites that you have been through a lot. You've been through a lot in the past 40 years. You've been tested and tried, and you've been through a lot of struggles. You've also been blessed like crazy, but you've been through a lot. So here's a warning. When you go and conquer Canaan and you start to prosper in the land, don't forget the Lord. And I wish we could just put a large foreshadowing sign over that, because I wonder what's going to happen in the future. And Moses is telling them exactly this. You will prosper in the land. Don't forget all the struggles and trials that you had and what the Lord did to help you. Basically, don't get too prideful, because you're going to be prospering so much in this promised land. All right, we skip a few chapters and we go to chapter 15. Now, chapter 15 is interesting, because when I read through it, I'm like, this seems like Moses is just reviewing some random commandments. Like, it's just like, care for the poor and forgive your debts from people, and here's how to sacrifice a lamb, and if you have slaves, here's how to deal with them. I'm like, wow, this is kind of a random chapter. It really covers the whole spectrum here. But the moment that I thought about it just a little bit deeper, I realized there is so much symbolism here in how the Lord treats us. Forgiving debts, sacrificing unblemished lambs, slaves. It's really interesting. So definitely read chapter 18 with your symbolism glasses on for sure. Otherwise, it just seems like, cool, Moses is reviewing some more commandments, which he is, but I think that's why we're studying this one in particular. And then chapter 18, remember how last week I mentioned that there had been some disputations among the Israelites about why the Levites were the only ones that held the priesthood. Why was their tribe the only one that held the priesthood, who they were then officiating in the tabernacle, right? And the Lord just wants to kind of double down on this through the prophet Moses and says, listen, I chose the Levites to hold the priesthood, that they are just the group that has been chosen. They're the house that's been chosen to hold the priesthood. But he also clarifies, which I think is interesting, is that they're splitting up the land by each tribe, right? So once they enter the promised land, they're like, okay, the tribe of Judah, you're going to go here. Tribe of Ephraim, you're going to go here. Like, they're getting it all set up. The tribe of Levi will not receive a special set apart land of inheritance, because they have been called to minister to everyone else. And so they will just be wherever the tabernacle is, or wherever they need to go and minister. They will not have a separate place for like, here's where all the Levites live and have their little place. They don't have their own separate land, which I think is just kind of interesting to consider, like the blessings that they're given and then the things that they're also asked to sacrifice in return. Interesting. Okay, and that is it for what we study in that second speech. Just as I said, little glimpses, little bits of doctrine. It's not a story, so we're not like skipping stuff. It's just more things that Moses is teaching about. Okay, final chapter, final speech, third speech, right? Moses gave 3 speeches. His final and third speech is actually chapters 29 and 30, and we study both of those chapters. So we get all of Moses's third speech here. And this is just a powerful speech because he has gathered the children of Israel at the foot of Mount Nebo. And in chapter 29, he just reminds them of all the blessings they've received. He talks about the commandments that they've been given and the blessings that they've been given as they kept those commandments. And then he leads them in making another covenant with the Lord. This is very reminiscent to what happened 40 years earlier at Mount Sinai. After receiving the 10 commandments, Moses did the same thing with the children of Israel, and now he's doing the same thing here. He's leading them in a covenant with the Lord there at Mount Nebo, and the children of Israel agree to the covenant. They agree to the terms of the covenant, and Moses just teaches a little bit more about that covenant and the blessings that'll come if they keep their part, and of course the consequences that come if they choose to not keep their part. And then chapter 30, the end of that speech, Moses does tell them Israel will actually be scattered at some point in the future. I know we've just gone on this long journey. All together, we're now entering the promised land, but in the future, the tribes of Israel will be scattered due to their unbelief. However, the Lord promises that he will then gather you again. And he will gather you again when you decide to remember and love the Lord again. Obviously, this prophecy is very important for us as we're studying because we are now in that point of gathering. We are gathering the children of Israel. We're gathering anyone who chooses to love and serve the Lord. And that's exactly what Moses taught the children of Israel thousands of years ago here on Mount Nebo. I think this last speech is pretty cool. All right, we do skip a few chapters here at the end that are not a part of a speech. It's just kind of some more procedural things. Basically, Moses blesses each house of the tribe of Israel and gives them little blessings. It feels a little reminiscent of like Father Israel, Jacob, giving the blessings, those patriarchal blessings to his sons. It feels very reminiscent of that. Like Moses is giving these final blessings to these tribes. But then we do end with chapter 34, which is the last chapter in the book of Deuteronomy as well. And this one is a bit of a story in that Moses knows he's not going to enter the promised land, right? The Lord told him that, and we learned about that in the book of Numbers last week. And so the Lord invites Moses up to the very top of Mount Nebo, and he tells him to look out, and he shows Moses the promised land. He knows Moses won't actually physically enter there, but he shows him, and it's just kind of this moment, I think, of like, we've made it, and look at this beautiful land that has been saved for the house of Israel, and this is the blessing. And then at the end of chapter 34, I have to tell you, I'm grateful for modern revelation, because if I was reading this without modern revelation, I'd be like, Moses dies and that's it. And we know that he transfers his priesthood to Joshua, who was one of the 2 good spies who gave a good report. Remember that? He's also the one who at the very beginning of the Exodus was leading the troops into battle. When Moses would raise his hands in prayer, they would be successful, and that whole story there. So this is Joshua. We've known about him for a while. He is the priesthood is passed on to him, and Joshua takes over as the next prophet and the next leader of the house of Israel. But we know from modern revelation, Moses doesn't die. He is translated. We know that he's translated because he comes back to earth at least 2 more times that we have records of. The first one is actually the Mount of Transfiguration during Jesus Christ's time. When the Savior went to the Mount of Transfiguration, we know that Moses was there. The other time is in the Kirtland Temple during Joseph Smith's time. We know that Moses appeared to Joseph Smith. And the reason why Moses needed to be translated is because he holds the keys of the gathering of Israel, which makes complete sense after all we've just learned about Moses. He holds those special keys of how to gather the children of Israel because he had already done it. He had already led them on an expedition, and he knew that they would be scattered, but he also knew that his keys would be used, the keys that had been given him would be used to then gather Israel in the future. So pretty cool. We get that direct priesthood power from Moses. But he is translated. This is kind of the end of an era, both like emotionally, but also very literally as well. I feel like anytime we've been with a scriptural character for a while and then they die, you're just like, oh, it's like a good friend, you know, like you've learned their story and now they're gone. And that's what we're doing with Moses, saying goodbye to his part of the story that we learned, but also quite literally, this is the end, at the end of Deuteronomy here, the end of the books of Moses. I talked about this a while ago, but the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are considered the books of Moses. They're also called the Torah. Our Jewish friends, these are the 5 books of the Old Testament that they study. We also know in Book of Mormon times, these were the 5 books that Nephi went to go get the brass plates. That's what was so essential. These were the brass plates that then all of the Nephite nation and Lamanite nation used as their scriptures. And that's why so many Book of Mormon prophets reference stories that we've read about just in the past few months here as we've studied these first 5 books of the Old Testament, because those were the scriptures that they had. This was it for them. Most of the time they're referred to as like Moses wrote them. Of course, you know, there's been some revisions and they've gone through some things since then. But for the most part, we do think that Moses at least recorded them, or at the very least, this is the story of the genesis of the earth all the way until Moses leading the children of Israel until right outside the promised land. So that's where we're at. That's where we end this week. And next week, I will tell you what this next portion of the Old Testament is all about, and how we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit differently than we have these first 5 books. Although it's taken us a while to get through these first 5 books, right? They are so important. They are filled with so many important doctrines. That's why our Book of Mormon friends needed them as their sole source of original scripture that they studied, which I think is pretty cool to acknowledge as well. All right. I think personally, my spiritual focus question is going to be this really big theme that Moses hits over and over again, which is, how do I show the Lord that I love him? How do I show the Lord that I love him? And if I can list a few things, how can I do even more? How can I show that love even more? Because there are so many promised blessings that await those who show the Lord that they love him. And that's what Moses teaches over and over and over again in these final speeches at the age of 120. After 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, this is the knowledge, the final knowledge that he wanted to give to the children of Israel is love the Lord and show it. Love the Lord and show it. So how can I do that as well? All right, have a great week this week and happy studying.